Hello again, everyone. As always, my name is Ross Edelstein, and I am your host for this new episode of the Unwelcome Access Podcast. Now, today's episode is going to be a little bit deeper than most episodes I've been doing lately. Today, we are doing an episode on paratransit. Now, on the screen, we have a photo from Philadelphia with mid-rise housing on either side and cars parked along the street. On the left, we have a SEPTA trolley coming down the street in one direction, and on the other lane, moving away from the view, we have a paratransit van, which is a small little bus van thingy in white. Now, paratransit is one of the ways that public transit is made accessible. It's also something that is fairly misunderstood and often confused with a couple of other forms of transit, which we'll get into here. But I want to start by getting into story time with Ross. Now, on the screen, we have my usual story time with Ross image. It is a picture of me looking absolutely angry, and actually I'm having the time of my life driving a train. But for this one, I want to talk about the time that I used what is not really paratransit, but often fills a similar role. When I was an undergrad, for a long time, I didn't have a car. I was in Kirksville, Missouri, which is a rural small city, and will come up later. But in Kirksville, they have KirkTran, which is a system that provides public transit second, disability service first. And it was great. The problem is that anytime I was on it, you could tell that it was underfunded and clearly it wasn't intended for the general public. Now, we'll talk a little bit about this in a moment, but public transit and paratransit is really a specialized service. And when it does get lumped in with other transit, it often ends up being less than ideal. Let's talk about what public transit is. Now, I've done an episode on travel, which I highly recommend you go back and look at, but to illustrate public transit, instead of a photo of Amtrak, I have a photo of Metra. We have a Metra diesel pulling a line of bi-level gallery cars down some train tracks in Chicago on the opposite track approaching the view that I have. Now, public transit, for the purposes of this episode and how I'll really approach it over this podcast, and it will come up again. We'll do a general public transit episode, so on and so forth. But it's really within a defined region. It's also more focused on same-day trips. So, for example, public transit is about going to the store or going into the city and then going back home, whether you're going to attend a show, going to work, whatever. And there's many ways that public transit can exist. There's also generally, not always, but generally multiple departures per day as opposed to a fewer number for long distance travel. Now, when we're talking about public transit, most people think of things like Metro, which is on the screen, or your metro systems, your New York subway, your CTA, etc., or buses. The problem is a lot of those aren't accessible. So, on the screen, I have a pair of buses in Seattle. One is a bendy bus and the other is just the front. And you have it in Seattle's downtown with the skyscrapers in the background and some trees framing it. Public transit is in a lot of ways inaccessible for a large number of people. One of the things that is important to remember is that as accessible as you can make public transit, and down the road we will be doing an episode on America's public transit being the most accessible in the world, but a lot of it is inaccessible for either physical or mental or cognitive reasons. Now, when I say this, there are people who physically cannot get to, say, a bus stop, or they might live near a station or a stop, but that isn't an accessible stop because the system's been underfunded for the last 75 years or whatever. Or there are people who will not be able to independently utilize, say, buses to transfer, or will be overwhelmed by going on the train or whatever. However, getting around is an important part of independent living. Now, I've brought up this study before, but there is a Department of Transportation study that basically points out that people still need to get places, and disabled people use public transit more than the general population, but they also generally are also bumming rides from their friends, family, etc., because a lot of that is inaccessible or in a lot of places just doesn't exist. The other part is that in many cases, this means that you really have to rely on others and can't live independently. Paratransit is intended to at least make it a little bit more independent for someone to live in an area if they can't use regular public transit or drive. Now, paratransit is also generally subsidized and less expensive for people who use it. When I say this, usually you have to pay a fee, but paratransit, as we'll get into, is a little bit more expensive to operate for a number of reasons, and so it's either heavily subsidized to keep it at the regular rate, or if you are receiving some sort of disability payment or service, it can often be free. In some cases, what is publicly thought of as paratransit, though, is the only service. And when I say this, most people think of paratransit as, like on the title slide, the little short bus that is really intended to serve specifically disabled people. That's sort of the popular definition, but there's a specific legal definition of what paratransit is. Before we get into that, let's talk about what it isn't. So on the screen, we have, as I mentioned on the Storytime with Ross slide, Kirktran. It is not paratransit. It fills that role, but it is not intended to be paratransit. It's actually the first thing on the screen, a deviated fixed route system. So your regular bus system is known as fixed route. It goes down the same route all the time. It doesn't leave it unless there's construction or whatever. A deviated fixed route system basically is that same fixed route, but you can call and say, hey, I need to be picked up at my house, instead of having to go all the way to the bus stop if you're not able to make it. Kirktran fills this model, and we'll get into funding on it, but this is very common for rural areas if they have a fixed route. You also have demand response routes, which that will sound very familiar with paratransit, but that's your sort of dial-a-ride, Uber, etc. Generally, for a demand response route, you are calling ahead or using an app or whatever. Anywhere from has to be reserved in advance to you can do it the same day in some areas. But generally, the routing is defined by who needs to use it, often like Uber or your other rideshare apps. Now, both of these are generally done in less developed areas, places where the population still needs to get places, and there's a willingness to invest in transit, but generally where you don't have the money or the need to put the full funding you would for, say, a full fixed bus route or any other transit. This is often to provide accessible services for people with disabilities. Kirktran, at one point, it's now fully operated by Kirksville, but when I was up in Kirksville doing my undergrad, it was actually funded by about 12 different agencies. It was first and foremost, though, funded by the Developmental Disabilities Board. It was intended to get disabled people who can't get around the city to appointments, etc. And then it expanded more and more and became what it is today. However, the central point of funding it is for that specific disabled population. Neither of these are paratransit. And in fact, most rural transit that comes about this way, where it's we need to get disabled people to and from the doctor, most of that is still used by everyone, or could be used by anyone. It still does fill that similar niche where it's first and foremost intended to serve disabled people. That being said, before we talk about paratransit itself, I'm going to go ahead and toss it over to Midroll Ross to go ahead and do our ad for the today. Wow, Future Ross, what a great ad. Or maybe there isn't one. As always, our primary sponsor is you, the viewer, over on patreon.com/unwelcomeaccess. However, this space is intentionally left open for disabled people who have a project, a business, something they want to get out there to help platform people who might not otherwise get a chance to share in this sort of format. That said, back to your regular programming, and I hope you enjoy the rest of the episode. So, as I mentioned, paratransit is a safety net and a complement to regular services, right? It is also a highly individualized support. Now, in education, and I will do an education episode soon, there's a concept called multi-tiered systems of support. I'll get into more detail about this in another episode, but essentially you have good as universal as possible design at the lower level, then you have a little bit more specialized, a little bit more individual, but not necessarily something that needs one-on-one support. And then you have the more one-on-one or extremely small group supports. Same applies to a lot of things with disability. You can have a really good basis, things like level boarding, or actually having good bus stops that you can use a deployable ramp at. And a lot of people will be supported. Then you might still need people who have chairs that can't do the ramps and might need a lift. Or you might need, say, specific travel training, which will be another episode down the road, and that is a more group support. Sometimes it can be more individualized. Paratransit is more that one-on-one level. And so, like a lot of things that require that one-on-one support, whether or not you need it is determined on an individual basis. And there are issues with this, but occupational therapists are the people who are making these determinations, and generally they're very good at looking at the whole human. Occupational here doesn't mean, say, your job, as it's often used. What it does mean is your life occupations, the things you do day to day. So, for example, an occupational therapist looks at recreation or going to a museum just as much as they look at how do we get somebody to have a job that is fulfilling for them. That said, to make the determination, and every system has their own more specific set of requirements, there are still some legal requirements And the big one for determining if somebody is eligible is first, do they have a disability that impacts boarding a transit vehicle? And that means both getting on, say having a wheelchair, but also, are they able to get to the stop? Can they understand getting to the stop individually? Will they, for example, get overwhelmed if there are 3 buses with 3 different route numbers? Will they, for example, if they have PTSD, get overwhelmed by the number of people? Things like that. And again, it's specific and something that every system does individually, but it is a consideration when we're talking about how do you decide who gets to use paratransit. Now, somebody who is eligible can have one companion, and some systems will allow more than one if there is room, but only one companion is required under the law. And by the law, I mean this is specifically the ADA standards for paratransit that I drew from. I'll have the link down in the description, along with Patreon links and all that. That said, paratransit has to be somebody who lives near a fixed route. So if you have a demand response system or a deviated fixed route system, you don't need paratransit. But you have to be 3/4 of a mile or less from the stop or station. As I mentioned, it's a safety net. Systems are allowed to go beyond that. But you aren't allowed to charge a premium for that 3/4 of a mile or less. Some systems do have beyond that and don't charge more. Some systems have a separate premium service that goes beyond that. But that is, again, based on individual transit systems as opposed to a firm or fast rule. Now, paratransit is a reservation service, and it's curb to curb or door to door, depending on how you want to define it. What that means is that paratransit picks you up at your home, drops you off where you're going, like a taxi or an Uber or whatever. Demand response systems also operate in the same way, and deviated fixed routes can operate in that way. Paratransit always does. But part of that is that you make reservations, and most paratransit systems require you to make a reservation at least a day ahead of time. Talk about this as a problem in a moment. I'm sure that some of you are starting to see one of the biggest issues with paratransit. But in general, you have to take reservations and operate the service during your normal hours. So if the bus is running, paratransit's running. And as I mentioned, paratransit rules do not require 2 deviated fixed route systems or demand response systems. Those already fill that same niche. That being said, let's talk about some of the problems. Now, on the screen, we have one of the PACE paratransit buses in Chicago, right in the loop. And it's a white mini bus van thingy with a more traditional entrance in the front with sort of these slide opening doors, and then a side lift for loading folks with disabilities who are chair users or can't do the stairs. First and foremost, reservations. Now, one of the issues, and I will have, again, that DOT report, but one of the biggest issues with paratransit is that it's great if you know you have an appointment and you know you have to be somewhere at a certain time and know you're going to be picked up from that place at a certain time. Unfortunately, life doesn't really work like that, as I'm sure everybody here knows. And so, for example, oh no, we're out of toilet paper. Well, if you use paratransit and are living independently, that kind of leaves it really hard for you to be able to get to where you need to go if you, for example, have it as a last minute thing and you can't wait until the next day. The other part is that paratransit is notoriously unreliable and not always timely. As I mentioned, it's a door-to-door system and it is a individualized system. For a lot of reasons, and we'll get to this in a moment, it has issues around things like we require you to be ready, say, 15 minutes ahead of time or within 15 minutes of your reservation. Now, this makes sense, and I believe it is in most systems actually smaller than that. Again, individualized and determined by system. But what that really says is, hey, you have to be completely ready for us. And in some cases, it can leave you waiting and waiting and waiting, much like anything else you might reserve that, say, has to make a route ahead of time. And part of this is that there are issues with capacity and staffing. Now, as mentioned, it's a safety net, but it's a safety net that's been cut and cut and cut. In the US, we have the issue of everything has to run like a business. This includes public transit, which notably is not a business, it's a public good, and it provides more than any sort of in and out revenue makes it seem. The thing about paratransit is being very individualized. It requires a lot more staff to make it work, and specifically staff to number of people that it can carry. It also requires specialized equipment and equipment that, if it's not working, well, that actually means that the service just doesn't operate. So it requires far more preventative maintenance than other supports and other parts of a transit system. It also requires staff who are trained to be able to help somebody with higher support needs, because again, paratransit generally is intended for folks who have higher support needs in one way, shape, or form, and who can't navigate to the bus stop. And again, it can mean anything from, I just am blind and don't know how to get around in a place that doesn't really have great, wayfinding, to somebody with high support needs and a developmental disability that makes it so that they can't communicate. This also means that the staff's more expensive. And so paratransit is often one of the areas that gets first cut back or cheapened. It's also often contracted out, and that makes it often less reliable, since that's usually done to the lowest bidder for a reason. But all this combines, and it means that when you are running at bare minimum capacity, if somebody who has a disability has a day that makes it harder for them to get around, they might not have the ability to get onto the paratransit vehicle easily that day, and it delays it, and it can delay it for other people. And because you have minimal capacity, well, it becomes a domino. And it's not anybody's fault, other than the people who are deciding, hey, we need to fund this as little as possible because it's too expensive and not producing enough revenue. This also leads to denials. So I have a family member who is legally blind, cannot drive, also has a mobility disability, and lives in a place where it is uphill both ways to the nearest bus stop. Because it is slightly more than 3/4 of a mile away, they were told, hey, we're not going to offer you the chance to use paratransit, even though it is impossible for them to get around otherwise. Oftentimes, this leads to people not being able to actually use the service if they would otherwise be qualified, or in some cases, if they can't pay for the premium one, well, you end up having a situation where somebody is denied the chance to get around because you've decided to put the ability to get from place to place behind a premium barrier. And then it gets more expensive when you have to use, say, Uber. And that's the only way you can get around, or more difficult to plan if you have to mooch off of your friends and family. Needless to say, even if it is a really good thing to have as a safety net, it's a safety net that repeatedly is getting holes cut in it. And it's something that really needs to be improved. Now, I have some ideas for this. And before we get into this slide, I'm not a transit planner, I'm not an urban designer, I do not play one on TV. I do, however, have a lot of background in understanding systems, and am getting a PhD in basically understanding systems of how we think. On the screen, we have the Salt Lake Union Trolley, not Salt Lake, South Lake Union Trolley. I don't know why I went Salt Lake there, but the South Lake Union Trolley coming into a station with various folks walking around it and various Seattle buildings in the background. The trolley is blue and it's sort of on a grassy bit. I just like this picture. I don't also have a lot of paratransit pictures. I apologize for that. But as I've sort of alluded to and explicitly said, number one thing to do, actually put money into it. Paratransit is a public good. Now, making all transit accessible is the ideal, so just fund transit, period. If people aren't worried about pinching nickels and dimes, you're going to have a better system, better services for people, and it's going to mean that people can actually use the system, whether it's paratransit or something else. Another part is find ways to make paratransit more usable for last-minute needs. It's 2025. A lot of paratransit systems plan on paper the day before. Because it is so heavily underfunded, despite the fact that putting money into it would make it run so much better and more efficiently, part of the planning process makes it basically impossible to use for last-minute needs. If you had more paratransit operators and more people out on the streets, potentially even run it closer to demand response, but for people who are eligible for paratransit, on top of your fixed route. Again, this is probably my most crank opinion on this, my most sort of out of left field opinion, but it is possible in my mind that you could actually run it that way. However, the last one is something that we can do. Lower those barriers to entry. Make it so that people can get access to paratransit who might not be able to do that right now. Make it so that, for example, you're not cutting people off for financial reasons. Make it so that you're not make it so that people are treated as a whole person, and also you're not rushing those evaluations, because oftentimes they are done at the bare minimum as well. That being said, lowering those barriers requires step one, and making it more usable also requires step one. Put more money into the thing. So, as always, go yell at your various folks who control the purse strings to put money into it, and to put money into all sorts of disability things. That said, I do appreciate everyone listening. I did redo this episode. I had a recorded version and I didn't like how it turned out. But I hope you enjoyed this episode, and I look forward to seeing you on the next one.
A huge shout out to the wonderful people over on Patreon who are helping to make this project happen. As always, we aren't getting any ad revenue from YouTube, and we also aren't. You'll also get your name up on the screen right about now, like these lovely people who have helped support the podcast. As always, thank you so much for listening, and I look forward to our next episode.
Unwelcome Access is a production of Autism, a disability and accessibility consulting organization.